Homeless Services Authority released its findings in 2022, we learned that houselessness across the LA region grew. There are now more than 69,000 people experiencing homelessness, a 4% increase from the last count in 2020. I want to take a quick moment to address language justice and why it's so important. So you just heard me use the terms houselessness and unhoused. I'm saying that because it acknowledges that people can become unhoused at different periods of time, and the concept of home is different for everyone. A home can be more than just a physical place. It could be a personal idea or a location that a person feels belongs to them. We don't want to use terms like homeless or hobo or transient, as they form a toxic narrative and can be seen as othering. We're joined today by a great panel of experts who are going to talk about where we are now, housing first principles that are proven to work, and the legal protections necessary to keep people from losing their homes. We're going to spend the second portion of our chat today talking about the Yes on Measure ULA campaign in the city of LA. Our panelists will be available after the chat to answer some questions and talk about how you can get involved. We're going to be using the Ask a Question feature on the host website, which is separate from the chat. We do encourage you to use the comment section in the chat to comment about what you're hearing, but if you want your question answered by the panel, leave it in the question stream. Now to the good part. I want to start by talking about where we are now with our housing crisis here in LA. And Zarita Jones is a fierce tenants' rights activist and native Angelino who serves as a member of several coalitions, such as the Right to Counsel and the LA Community Land Trust. We had some technical difficulty with Zarita, but she's joining us by phone this evening. So Zarita, I'm sorry about that. Thank you for joining us. I want to start this chat by asking if you can share with everyone what types of people are affected by the housing crisis.
Thank you so much, Ethan. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a big question. When you say who's being affected, the discussions now are turning towards, our Black homeowners are being completely eradicated in this market. And we're talking about the eviction rates and the rates of homelessness that are causing a cultural erasure within communities for not only African Americans, but for our Spanish Americans also. We're talking about seniors. That's one of the key points that people seem to forget about, is that is a fast growing group, and they're being displaced in staggering numbers. They're on fixed incomes, and senior housing complexes are not immune to the grasp of corporate landlords and their buying and their waves of eviction. We're talking about our LGBTQ, our youth. In addition to the negative treatment and attacks and the discrimination, which is staggering, they are not being housed at a rate in which our young people on a regular are being housed. We also want to talk about our people with disabilities and our mental health challenges. They're actually targeted when it comes down to housing and treatment, not only because some of them are on Social Security or Section 8, and even though there's not supposed to be any discrimination, we all know that there is. Housing insecurity is kind of across the board when you're looking at people that are living from, one paycheck to the next, or one hardship or hiccup away. We're looking at those people that are spending 60 to 90% of their income on housing. We're looking at how all of these facets are interconnected and how this crisis affects everyone. And with, of course, COVID-19 and this pandemic that we're all trying to come out of, it has just unveiled what we already knew, but now we have a bird's eye view of, just the disparities and the housing market and how people are getting swallowed up or ignored to that matter. With the conversations that we've been having, a lot of times most people skip over it, but it's the children. I always try to take and bring light that when a family or a person gets disabled, there's always, not disabled, but are struck with homelessness or eviction, there are children that are wrapped up into these families that, people don't really want to talk about. But one of the organizations that I'm with, we talked about how LAUSD has literally identified over 20,000 homeless children that are actually just in the LAUSD system alone. And we need to talk about how this is a rounded problem, how so many people are being affected.
I'm so glad you brought up
Also,
uh, go ahead.
sure, go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, I was
No, I
saying I'm
yield to
so
you.
glad that you brought up. I'm so glad that you brought up the point about how this crisis really does affect everyone and how interconnected we all are. I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how segregated, though, the crisis is when it comes to the displacement of people or who are unhoused.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we already knew historically. There were, there's this redlining and which, avenues are or neighborhoods that are being targeted. But when you look at the scope of the economic inequality, we're talking about the policies that were put in place that were actually somewhat discriminatory. Not somewhat, they were. But the light has been shown, and these are also part of these conversations that these pockets of these neighborhoods. We're talking about neighborhoods that were disinvested, disenfranchised, and they are now being targeted for gentrification. And it's not just the people who are currently unhoused, but people that are struggling to stay housed, that are also part of this, I'm going to say, tsunami or tidal wave. We're talking about the current laws that and ordinance that were there or supposed to protect them, and the agencies that are responsible that need to be acting in good faith on their behalf in order to make sure that these crises of segregation and discrimination aren't happening, and certain neighborhoods aren't targeted more than others.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zarita, for that. I want to now introduce Andreina Kniss, who is an organizer with the group K-Town for All. Before joining K-Town for All, Andreina worked as a paralegal doing eviction defense, and her organization makes hygiene kits. They offer support services and do a lot of political advocacy for unhoused people. I want to thank you for joining us, Andreina. And earlier, I shared the numbers from the most recent point in time counts, but can you talk a little about why the count keeps going up?
Yeah, as we mentioned, we go out there here in the Koreatown neighborhood every Saturday to do outreach with folks, and we develop relationships. So we begin talking to them. We don't ask them up front, like, how did you end up here? But eventually, a lot of them will open up, and it's common things that can happen to anyone. So, a paycheck getting messed up, COVID, bedridden, some people losing a week of work that leads directly to an eviction, um, getting hospitalized for any other conditions, um, job loss, you name it, divorce, domestic violence. Those are very common things that people are facing. But also, gentrification. So a lot of these people who haven't missed a day of work, who haven't missed a rent payment, are still susceptible to eviction. Because developers are buying these big apartment complexes and they want these long-term tenants to leave so they can raise the rent. So we're seeing a little bit of all of that basically add up to LA's having more people become unhoused every single day than we can house with all of these supportive programs that we have. So that's why these numbers keep going up. And this is just a reality that we see week after week. We have seen a lot of folks that have been unhoused for like years at a time, but we're also seeing an influx of people who have never been unhoused, particularly the elderly that have never been unhoused a day in their lives that are now facing this reality.
Yeah. I think you all have a video clip of Koreatown for All's work that we're going to share with everyone that really does show the human impact of the encampment sweeps. And so we're going to play a little clip of that for everyone now.
What's a day in the life of being homeless not like?
I guess sometimes silence says it best.
There was a sweep.
Yeah, I think it's 30 police cars.
Yeah.
No sanitation. Automatically handcuffed everybody, searching everybody, trying to take people to jail. I wasn't even on the side where all the tents are at, and the police, they handcuffed me.
They handcuffed you?
Yeah, and they gave me a ticket
For what?
for having a tent up.
Was it your
But
tent?
I don't live there even.
These series of sweeps that are devastating people and throwing away everything that they have, so that people who lose all of their property, they have to start over. And it just sets people back on their path to housing. It makes it really difficult for people to get out of homelessness.
No, but the last time they were here, they took all of our laundry, they took all of our clothes, and they took a bag full of with a bunch of paperwork in it then, but I don't even know. I can't say it was in it. They were going to take the food, and I said, can't we keep the food?
Yeah, that was some really powerful testimony from both the houseless and Jane Nguyen, who is an organizer with K-Town for All. Andreina, can you talk about the ways that the city of LA helps or hinders the progress for your clients?
Well, I will say that it's been very, very difficult as of lately, just because of how aggressive the city has become in criminalizing the unhoused. 4118 was passed, and since then, the amount of area where they do this kind of carceral enforcement, these sweeps, where they basically show up, they give people a black plastic bag and a timer, and tell them that whatever doesn't fit in that bag in that amount of time gets thrown out. And we've just heard time after time, people getting tickets that rack up tons of fines, people having their cars towed that they live in. We face so much difficulty meeting these people again because they get displaced. It's really hard to form relationships with people after sweep, just in the sense that that person might have lived there for a year or two, and we might have developed a great relationship, and then after a sweep, they're gone and there's no way to contact them. And this in particular is very, very difficult to link people to services. So if we're talking about getting people out of homelessness, it's completely contrarian to support sweeps because they completely disconnect people from us who have connections to the internet, who have connections to housing, shelters, etc. And it forces them to start all over every time. As Jane said in our video, paperwork gets thrown out, IDs get thrown out, medication gets thrown out. There's really no limits to what we've seen them thrown out. And every single time it happens, now with 4118, it's weekly in some places. We go out there and we replace what we can on a weekly basis. And some of that stuff is irreplaceable. So, if they had paperwork for a housing wait list or their Medi-Cal paperwork, things like that's gone, and they have to figure out how to get it again. And that's impossible when you're unhoused often. So it's very cyclical, and we have 69,000 people out here. Clearly it's systemic, and clearly our policy of spending this money, paying for police officers, paying for sanitation to show up and throw away all their stuff is not helping anyone, because these levels continue to rise year after year, and we're just seeing it become this kind of heated topic between politicians saying that the police are not acting stern enough, and other people clamoring for shelters and things like that, which we support the building of shelters, but at the end of the day, what's really going to solve this is building more housing, making all of it affordable, making it accessible to folks, bridging that gap between unhoused people and all the burdens they face, and bringing that kind of support to them, not displacing them, not throwing their stuff away that causes them to start over and over again. And at this point, through the pandemic, a lot of what KFA was trying to do was to push the city to offer services instead of just sweeping them. So, in terms of COVID, we pushed them to put hand washing stations and bathrooms near encampments. We've pushed them to put trash cans near encampments. A lot of the problems that folks have with unhoused populations could be solved with support from the city, which we're not seeing.
Got it. Thank you so much, Andreina, for that. I wanted to now turn to Kath Rogers, who is the staff attorney on the ACLU SoCal Dignity for All project. Kath has an extensive background in civil rights advocacy, and a lot of her efforts have centered on advancing policies about housing justice, labor and immigration rights, along with defending unhoused clients and activists. Thank you for joining us, Kath. I mentioned your work on advancing housing justice, so I wanted to know if you can share some insight into how we got here and the current government response that we have.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Ethan. And throughout my legal career, I've represented mostly unhoused folks, and all of the experiences that Andreina just talked about are exactly right on. That, people are being ticketed just for living outside. They are, constantly swept. Their things are being taken by police. And these are policy choices, right? So these are deliberate policy choices that cities, jurisdictions are making. And houselessness and housing insecurity as a whole are policy choices. We need to have the political will and the courage to solve these things and think in big ways and think systemically to change them. One point that I want to uplift is how we got here, and some of the policies that led us to where we are now. And the modern era of houselessness really started in the 1970s. And at that time, there was massive defunding of federal housing programs, defunding of federal subsidies. And the issue really gained traction in the media in the 1980s when FEMA took over the emergency response for houselessness. And the thought was at that time that the situation would really resolve once the economy got better. And it didn't. That's the short answer is, I think there was a large assumption that people would find housing as soon as the economy rebounded. And obviously we've seen that didn't take place. So following these policy decisions, federal policy decisions, there's massive numbers of unhoused people grew, and massive wealth inequality between the highest income earners and the lowest. And the national stock of affordable housing and vouchers and subsidies was decimated. And today, here in California, we only have 30 affordable housing units for every 100 households that need affordable housing. In terms of Section 8, we hear about Section 8, which is an important program that provides housing stability for some people, but it's inaccessible for most people. It's more like a lottery system, actually. The wait list for that program can last a decade, and you may never win that lottery. So when we talk about these things, I think it's important to realize these are policy decisions that are being made by the government, and we can reverse those policy decisions. And the other thing I want to really point out is causes of houselessness versus precipitating events. And Andreina talked about the types of stories that clients have that may precede houselessness. And my clients have had the exact same experiences that Andreina has talked about, whether that's eviction or job loss or divorce or maybe a fight with a family member. Everyone has a different story. And those are individual narratives. But if we want to look at causes, we need to look at systems and structures, and we need to look at the government, and we need to look at affordability of housing. I didn't create this metaphor. It's been widely used, but the housing market, especially as it relates to affordable housing, has been compared to a game of musical chairs. And imagine, 10 friends playing musical chairs, and there's only 8 chairs. And a couple of the friends maybe have a cast or a broken ankle or something. And at the end of that game, only 8 people, if there's only 8 chairs, only 8 people are going to be sitting down at the end of that game. Now, if the person who has the cast on or has the sprained ankle is not sitting in a chair, does that mean that their injury caused them to be chairless? No, it was a vulnerability. It was a preceding event, precipitating event, certainly, but it didn't cause it. And so we need to look at the underlying cause of houselessness, and that is the lack of affordable housing. Here, the chairs are affordable housing. We don't have enough of it for people who need it. I think that's one thing we need to look at, is just differentiating cause from personal blame and personal narrative, because too often the media portrays this as about personal blame and personal failings. And we really need to get away from that. In order to solve this problem, we need to galvanize people into understanding the cause, and the root cause is lack of affordability and massive wealth inequality in this country.
Yeah. I know that you see the city's budget cap as a moral document, and I wanted to know if you think that the current budget adequately addresses the crisis that we all find ourselves in.
Well, the short answer would be no. I don't think so. Yes, budgets are moral documents, and I think that's especially relevant tonight in our discussion of the Yes on Measure ULA campaign, where we're going to talk about budgeting. But the proposed budget for next year, we're looking at about $12 billion in the city of LA. Almost a third of that goes to policing, to things like what Andreina was talking about, with sweeps, with criminalization of poverty, whether that's low-level offenses that affect people who are living in poverty, who have their vehicles towed, or sweeps like the ones that Andreina talked about. There will be some increases to the LA houselessness budget next year, which are welcome, and some increases in permanent supportive housing, but nowhere near at the levels that we need to see to solve this crisis. And any of the budget for houselessness is vastly outshadowed by the policing budget, just as one example, which is almost a third of our budget. So no, it's not a moral document, and it should be, and we need to pay attention to budgets because really that's how our values are playing out in practice and in policy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one more kind of circle back, Cap, to a point that you made earlier about the lack of affordable housing, and I'm curious if you think that our current zoning laws or environmental protections that we have in place, are they, in theory, they're meant to help, the environmental protection laws and things like that, but do you see them as an obstacle to building more affordable housing? And is that the reason why we haven't been able to make the progress that we should have?
Well, I would say that we should look, well, first of all, I want to go back to something Zarita talked about with regard to zoning laws, which are some of the historic racism that went into redlining, and zoning laws historically have been basically created the massive wealth gap we have, and the lack of intergenerational wealth in the form of homeownership for Black families, the eviction rates for Black families, and the fact that 40% of folks who are unhoused nationally are Black, despite being only about 7% of the general population. And so policies related to zoning and also banking and lending created that and created the massive racial inequity that we see. So with respect to zoning policies, that is one historic massive injustice that's led to the racial inequity that we see today. In terms of how zoning laws play out in practice today, yes, there are primarily local zoning laws that solicit community involvement, that bring NIMBYs, which are not in my backyard, in force to community meetings to block urban affordable development. And that is a major problem. In terms of environmental laws, I mean, very few actually of affordable projects are even litigated. So it would be a very small number, less than 3% or something. So in terms of environmental laws, I mean, we need to see these things as interconnected, and especially seeing environmental justice and economic justice as inextricably linked. So I definitely don't want to, place blame on environmental laws tonight. I do think, like you said, some of the local zoning issues are real, but I think we need to look at the big picture, which is housing affordability and lack of government investment in housing.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much, Kath. And I feel like now we all are kind of like on a good baseline for understanding how we got here. And so for the second half of this chat, I think now we should shift our attention and talk about where we want to go. So what exactly do just policy solutions look like for equitable housing in LA? We all know that this problem has persisted for decades, and there's been a patchwork of efforts from local government trying to alleviate the crisis. I found that a 2021 poll conducted by the Los Angeles Business Council Institute and the LA Times found that voters want the government to act faster and focus on shelter for people living in the streets, even if those efforts are short-term and fall short of permanent housing. Polling also suggested that most voters have empathy for houseless people, but are growing impatient with the region's leadership. And so that brings us to the Measure ULA campaign. Measure ULA campaign, for anyone that does not know, is a citizens initiative on the November ballot that, if passed, will create a permanent fund for affordable housing and tenant protections in the city of Los Angeles. The measure has two goals: one, creating more affordable housing, and two, preventing more people from becoming unhoused. A recent study by the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA says that it expects an annual revenue stream of $923 million if this passes. And you can learn more about the policy in the resources section. And I encourage everyone that is watching right now to take some time to kind of go and read through that. Right now, though, our panelists are going to discuss aspects of the solutions and give us a little more insight. And Zarita, I want to bring you back in and start with you. Housing is currently seen as a commodity, and I want to know if you think that we should be rethinking that.
Most definitely. We wrote a report as part of a cohort of UCLA with Luskin 2020, and it was entitled Decommodifying Housing in COVID-19. And it's a very extensive report. It's free to anyone. And it talks just about, some of the solutions. I think governments should try to kind of move away from, housing being a commodity. What happens is Kat had talked about, the segregation and the nature of not only LA's crisis, but some of the other larger cities with the displacement, with the gentrification. And there has always been this division. But again, it's part of conversations. The new conversation has this racial justice component, and, the statistics are staggering, and they can't really be ignored. I believe that, with housing being a commodity the way that it is, it actually causes the mistreatment of human beings for profit. And, and it allows, billionaires and millionaires and the differences between the haves and the have-nots to act with carte blanche, and the government and their policies and the agencies and the overall criminalization, as we've heard. when you look at the inequity of the power between, property owners with millions and billions, and then you talk about the renters that are actually rent burdened and spending their time and their labor and their energy just trying to maintain a roof over their head, and you're looking at the quality of life that's at stake. And some of the examples that we've heard is about, landlord harassment, the intimidation. There's also retaliation for people speaking up. I apologize. I live 1 block from a fire station. But also just simply tenants asking for repairs and these unlawful evictions. And, we're talking about how these evictions are aimed and are systematically, and the owners are getting around, these legal renter protections and their legal obligations that are actually within their lease and their rental agreements. We're talking about tenant organizing, as a necessity to build power. We have, organizations that are really, really boots on the ground for tenants. We're talking about ACE, the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. It's ACE Action LA. We're talking about the Los Angeles Tenants Union. We're talking about SAGE, Strategic Actions for a Just Economy. We're talking about knowing and teaching organizing, because it's our right for tenants to learn how to, build these tenant associations within their buildings, and just know your neighbors. A lot of times we figure out that individuals not knowing their neighbor is part of an issue. That's the way that the higher ups and the landlords, they don't want us to speak, because when we speak, then we get friendly, we become a community, and therefore we start to organize, and we hear about things that your neighbor may be going through that you're not going through. And so some of the massive amounts of organizing that goes on in the city, for example, I'm within this battle of Chesapeake Apartments right now, and it's a big lift. It's 425 units. It belongs to a billionaire landlord that has neglected to make repairs over 20 years, and now we have tenants that are actually sick and have had lead paint exposure and raw sewage and all of these things. So one of the things we need to do is to bring awareness to the injustice. We need to, expose what's going on by direct actions, having these marches, having these rallies. We need to take and have these press conferences and these radio spots and, and be interviewed by the LA Times and some of these news media outlets. And don't forget our social media, and we can write letters and petitions and do our personal comments, at our city councils. We can be leaders in initiating some of these new policies, just like Measure ULA. We can also be boots on the ground organizing. We can door knock. We can do our town halls, our panels, and every second Saturday, second and fourth Saturday, you'll find me giving a workshop at the Los Angeles Tenants Union. But when we deal with this, you have to understand there's an overlying, government umbrella that we need to figure out. How do we need to make this change? How do we organize? How do we bring attention? And we need to stop using housing as a commodity. Back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, that was some really, really interesting points that you brought up. And I think that for people to hear that, it's one thing, like people are struggling with their landlords and, having difficulty staying in their homes. That's why I want to show now a video that we want to share with everyone that's watching that really does kind of illustrate how tenant protections can prevent houselessness. And this is from your organization. So we're going to load that up now.
We had to leave our place, a residence in El Sobrante, about 3 years ago, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience. It ended up in my husband and I being homeless, living in a van for 2 months. I had chemotherapy going on at that time and immunotherapies for my breast cancer. And so I wouldn't want anyone to go through what I went through. especially here in the city that I love. I've had landlords do horrendous things. I've had landlords not make any repairs. I've had landlords harass us. We need to pass rent control, anti-harassment, and just cause. We're one of the only cities here that does not have these protections. It's time to come into the 21st century and give us these protections so we can go about our lives normally, raising our families. We don't want to look at the possibility of homelessness. I've been there. You don't want that. And we don't want that for the city. The city is better than this. We can do things. We can pull together and we can do this. So please, please, let's not put this off any longer. Pass these things so we can have a cohesiveness as a city. We're protected. We have roofs over our heads and we can live our lives.
Yeah, that was a very impassioned plea from Jackie Lowery with the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment. And Zarita, I wanted to ask you, do you think that that clip makes a good case for why tenant protections are needed?
Most definitely. I believe that because of, I guess you could say the current state of affairs, tenant protections are crucial. And I think they're paramount into decreasing our homeless numbers. And when you talk about how the market is being controlled, okay, we really need to make a crucial dent in the homeless numbers and within this crisis. And we need to stop the actual mode of operation of the way that, billionaire landlords, are used to, and I'm going to say used to, treating people in the ill way in which she mentioned. And they're used to ignoring the tenants, and they're ignoring the fact that, housing definitely is a human right. And when we talk about protections against harassment and discrimination, we did pass Tahoe, which is the tenant anti-harassment ordinance, but it is yet to be implemented in a way that it makes a dent, and the people are getting the just results that they need from the ordinance. And we are talking about, the right to counsel, that was passed, and, the eviction legal representation that people need when they get served with these harassing and sometimes illegal evictions. We're talking about support for tenant organizing and unionization. And we're talking about, so every tenant knows that they have a right to organize and to protect themselves against the unjust things that are happening. And then also we want to also concentrate on direct aid and rental assistance, like the recent ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, where those funds went directly to landlords for people that were affected during COVID-19, and it kept the people in their homes. And, all of these protections are very crucial because of the mistreatment of some of these corporate landlords and the methodologies in which they're using. Back to you, Ethan.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm curious to know if you believe that the Measure ULA campaign supports these points that you were just making about like having the right to counsel and the direct aid and rental assistance. If you can kind of briefly talk about that.
Yes, as a matter of fact, our future LA is where this kind of materialized out of, and we were instrumental with a lot of these organizations that were mentioned here within this panel of putting this together. And with this measure, it was drafted by not only homelessness and housing boots on the ground individuals and organizations that work directly with, if not experienced, homelessness. And it also, formulates and allocates financial assistance to low-income seniors that are in danger of becoming homeless because their properties and them themselves are being targeted. It wants to use the profits from, real estate sales of over $5 million to invest back into the neighborhoods that are hardest hit, which is really, really important. I think, the funds will allow us to create and get new and more innovative solutions, so we can build housing faster at a lower cost, because, commodifying housing has only made it more expensive. Prior to COVID, we're looking at somewhere between 400,000 and now in excess of 700,000 to build one unit. That's ridiculous. So, I say yes on Measure ULA. We need to support these goals, and we need to put a dent in this crisis. Back to you, Ethan.
Thank you so much, Zarita. And I know for sure in my work as a reporter, I've definitely come across many unhoused people who have shared stories with me about how difficult it is to find housing. And I want to kind of loop Andreina back in, because you're an organizer with K-Town for All, and I'm sure that you have likely also heard many of these stories as well. And I wanted to know if you can share with everyone what some of those barriers actually look like.
Yeah, I think the difficult part right now in Los Angeles is that people think that there's a lot of support for people right now, and that they're just not taking it, when my experience, in talking to hundreds and thousands of people that are unhoused, is that there are no services. There are very little services. It's very rare that I meet someone who isn't on some kind of waiting list. As Kath mentioned, the Section 8 program in LA is a lottery, and that lottery's wait list has been closed for years. I think they're about to reopen for 2 weeks, and they're expecting about 500,000 people to apply to get on the waiting list to maybe one day get a voucher. So that's just kind of some of the problems we're facing, is there is no housing. We also have very little shelter beds for folks. So there's about 14,000 shelter beds, and now we know there's about 69,000 unhoused people, which is a giant gap. So even getting someone in a shelter is difficult, and those shelters themselves are not in great conditions. They're often dirty. They're unsafe during COVID. They're unsafe for reasons like assault and theft. They're just not known to be very good places, which is why a lot of people don't prefer to go in them. There's also the fact that to get into these shelters, you usually have to give up all of your possessions. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get housing at the end of that shelter. So the way it works is usually you get to stay for 3 months. And if you haven't found a permanent place to go after those 3 months, you're out on the street again. So we're doing this kind of cycle where we're begging people to go in these shelters, and then people get into shelters, and then there's nothing for them at the end of that tunnel. And then on top of that, place, disability barriers. So the ability for people to get around town, the ability to fill out paperwork. Like for a lot of these programs, you have to fill out stacks and stacks of paperwork, bank accounts, you got to stay connected, you got to keep a phone. All these things are so hard for an unhoused person to do, to keep in touch with that kind of lifeline. And housing is just so inaccessible, and it's just not there.
Yeah, really, really great points that you made. And I'm not sure if we did this earlier in our conversation, Andreina, but can you talk about what Housing First is? And can you share how the measure will advance Housing First goals?
So the concept of Housing First is basically, we know people need food, we know they need mental health treatment, we know they need job training, all sorts of things. These people that are unhoused needs a lot of support. But the argument that Housing First makes is that housing should be the first thing that they have. And once a person has housing, they're a lot more stable and able to access all these other supports. So for example, this is allegedly the policy of the state, but in practice, it's very different. As I said, here in LA, you can go into a shelter, and then there's nowhere for you to go once you're done with your 3 months. So that's kind of the end of that path. So in a Housing First scenario, before worrying about, putting people into job training programs or detoxing them if they're on drugs and they'd like to pursue rehab, we make the argument that it's a lot easier to get people these services when housing is provided. And in the case of ULA, part of the funding gathered from this measure would go to funding public housing, affordable housing. And it would also keep people housed, particularly seniors. As I mentioned, seniors are one of the fastest growing groups becoming unhoused currently. I've seen a lot of older people on the streets where it was more of a rare sight before. And keeping these very vulnerable people housed is crucial to getting them to go to the doctor, getting them to do any job training, mental health support, any other kind of support that they might need. Housing should be a priority, and it should be the number one priority of a society to give their most vulnerable. Housing should always come first. And that's something that we heavily support because we've seen just how limiting being unhoused is for anything else. People can't get their children back from CPS if they don't have a house. People can't start going to college if they don't have a house. There's nowhere to study. They can't sleep at night. Housing just seems to be that base that people need to be able to do anything to better their lives.
Yeah. Thank you so much for breaking that down, Andreina. I wanted to go back now to Kath, because earlier we were talking about budgets being a moral document. And I'm curious, Kath, if you think that Measure ULA holds up in that regard.
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. And also I want to circle to what Andreina just left off with, which ties into your question. Basically, one thing I want to point out is that Measure ULA and Housing First principles in general don't allocate funding toward shelters, but actually put that money into long-term housing that we know actually solves the houselessness crisis. And so that's one of the budget justice things that I think is important about Measure ULA is that this goes to permanent affordable housing rather than shelter. Because when we have a limited pot of funds and we're making that policy decision about where to spend money, do you build a shelter or do you put that into long-term housing? The answer is clear. It's long-term housing because that's actually the solution. As Andreina pointed out, shelter redefines houselessness, but it doesn't actually end it because as she talked about, there's no real light at the end of the tunnel. It's temporary. All the clients who I've worked with over the years, nobody has wanted to go into congregate shelters. You get beat up. They're dangerous. All the things Andreina talked about. There was a study this year, a RAND study that talked about how people don't want congregate shelter. In polling of unhoused folks, like people just across the board don't want it. Some of the studies that have come out post-COVID, where there have been more private hotel situations, have shown that creates better outcomes for people because they're not in these congregate settings, which are very harmful. So that's one issue that I think is really exciting about Measure ULA is that all the funding goes to housing and renter protections. Also, another exciting budget justice principle is that of progressive funding, which just means that Measure ULA is paid for by people with the most means, right? Anyone selling a property over $5 million will pay this tax, and nobody else will. It'll only apply to about 4% of real estate transfers citywide. So a very small group of people paying for, as opposed to a regressive tax that falls and burdens the most vulnerable and the poorest members of society. Oh, sorry, Ethan, you can go.
No, you can finish your thought if you want to.
Okay. Well, I was just going to sort of crystallize what Andreina had mentioned previously about the fact that Measure ULA will go both upstream and downstream, which I think is a really important feature of this policy because to go downstream, what you're doing is you're funding new affordable housing, which is desperately needed. And we need that because countywide, 20 people become unhoused every day. Yet we're housing, I think it's 227 people per day. And yet more people than that are becoming unhoused every day. So we just aren't keeping pace. So we desperately need the downstream solutions, but we also need to go upstream and have people be able to keep their housing and protect people who are housed. And that's where Measure ULA comes in with the tenant protections that Sarita was talking about and protecting people from illegal rent hikes and unlawful evictions, and really supporting a right to housing. And that's something Zarita mentioned, and I want to uplift that because the ACLU did a report earlier this year on right to counsel and looked at this critical measure. When we're in court, say for a criminal matter, you're entitled to a lawyer because you stand to lose everything, right? You could go to jail, but if you stand to lose your home, mostly you don't get access to a lawyer, and you're not entitled to it by law. So what this is saying is that you should have a right to a lawyer if you're going to lose your home. And overwhelmingly, cities that have a right to counsel have much better outcomes. The majority of people facing eviction proceedings with counsel end up not having an eviction on their records. Many more have access to rental assistance and are not forced to relocate. So it's vastly better outcomes for people. And as you would imagine, most landlords are represented, most tenants are not. So this is a crucial piece of Measure ULA.
I really want to really quickly, briefly, if you can kind of touch on one aspect that I think a lot of people may be curious about. And because we're talking about people who are most vulnerable, and Andre mentioned this earlier about meeting people where they're at. Very briefly, the bill, to some people, would say it doesn't do enough to address people who are struggling with addictions. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that aspect of long-term funding services and meeting, those people where they are.
Definitely. Well, behavioral health is certainly an important, right. We should have affordable health care. We should have free health care. But as I mentioned earlier, the over focus on behavioral health kind of diminishes sometimes the overall structural piece, which is housing affordability. And so I think what Measure ULA does, while it doesn't address the behavioral health piece, that's addressed separately, housing is a form of healthcare, right? We see that people deteriorate rapidly when they're on the street. Even short bouts of houselessness can be majorly damaging in someone's life. And when you're on the street, there's an effect called scarring, is what researchers call it, that you are much more likely to it's difficult to escape, basically, houselessness for the longer that you are houseless. It becomes all the factors kind of accumulate in your life, whether they're economic or physical or medical. So getting people housed and housing first principles are really important. And of course, behavioral health, mental health, all of those voluntary programs are so important and should be funded. Measure ULA doesn't address that, but it does address housing first, which is a form of healthcare.
Okay. Yeah, I really wanted one more, because I'm really curious about this too, because I was thinking about all the people that I've interviewed before who may have voted for previous measures to address the crisis that we find ourselves in right now. And so what are your thoughts on the oversight aspect of this and the transparency aspect of this for people who are like, this just seems like something else that we've already done and it didn't work the first time?
Well, yeah, I think that's a really important point, is just kind of differentiating Measure ULA from past measures. And it's there are a lot of things that are different about it, including the Citizens Oversight Board. It calls for strong citizens oversight, appointed positions that include people with lived experience, include housing and houselessness experts, so who would be overseeing the funding into indefinitely, basically. So there's, citizens who are going to be overseeing this. It's one of the strongest oversight mechanisms for any of these measures that we've seen. So that's really exciting. And just kind of the transparency and accountability that creates is really important. And also, I think differentiating Measure ULA too, because it is a long-term funding mechanism. And unless voters in the future, vote to overturn it or something, it's an indefinite funding stream, as opposed to past measures, which have been one-time funding as opposed to indefinite. So that's another big distinction. And then, like I talked about earlier, it goes upstream to keep people housed, which other measures previously did not do. So this is a really unique policy.
All right. Thank you so much, Kat, for that. And I know that we've covered a lot here today, and I know I've certainly learned a lot, and I really appreciate all of our panelists sharing their expertise. We are going to have time for a Q&A. We do want to get to some of the questions, but right now I do want to hand it over to Zarita, Andreina, and Kath, so they can share more about what you can do to get involved if you want to get more involved in Measure ULA.
Yeah, thank you all for being here tonight. If you all would like to get involved, of course, you are welcome to join us at K-Town for All. We go out and do outreach every Saturday in the Koreatown neighborhood. You can follow us on Instagram, K-Town for All, and same on Twitter. We post our outreach. You can join your local tenants union. If you don't have a local one, build your own. But here in LA, we have the giant LA Tenants Union. And keep in touch with ACLU SoCal that put on great events like this that keep you informed with our local measures, voting initiatives, and laws.
Yeah, definitely get involved, like Andreina said, in your local groups, including K-Town for All. Another thing specific to Measure ULA is we really need folks to help get out the vote and educate voters. And so phone banking and canvassing are two big ways you can do that. And so I personally will be out on October 13th with several ACLU colleagues and our economic justice team. So if you want to join us on October 13th, also on the resources page, we have a link where you can sign up to volunteer for the campaign, to do canvassing, phone banking. Honestly, the biggest thing you can do is educate voters, because this is direct democracy at work. We all are going to determine whether Measure ULA passes. And so tell your friends, tell your family. And I'll turn it over to Zarita as well.
You guys said pretty much all of it. And one of the things that I was going to say is, by all means, make sure if you got a couple of hours in a day, phone banking is awesome. Telling a friend is always having these conversations. What I like to do is every meeting that I attend with, across the board in LA, I always give an announcement during announcement times, let them know what measures are there, why they're important. And by all means, when it's time to vote yes on Measure ULA.
All right. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate that. All right. Yeah, I'm back on. All right. So I feel like we covered so much, and I think that you all may have done like a really excellent job of kind of like explaining this, because we really don't have too many questions that have come through. But let me check and see. Okay. Oh, okay. Here is a good one. Let me see. Okay. Question for Andreina or Zarita. In addition to passing Measure ULA, which will help tenants secure a new affordable place to live, how do we solve this crisis 50 years in the making, and what are some of the longer-term visionary solutions?
I can take that first, Rita. I think one of the big, as Kat pointed out, keeping people housed is the solution to addressing this problem, in my opinion. It's kind of like you're in a boat. We have these cool metaphors today. It's like you're in a boat, and the way to keep a boat from sinking is to not let any water in. Like right now, we're bailing out the boat, but if we would have waterproofed the boat, we wouldn't be in this predicament in the first place. So acknowledging that housing is a human right, acknowledging that the importance of people being housed outweighs the right of a landlord to do whatever they want, because housing has to be a priority, is important for health, is important for our society. I definitely think strong tenant protections, rent control, extra protections if you have a disabled person or an elderly person or children in the home, funding for lawyers for people facing their landlords in court who often have lawyers and money. I think all of these things that Measure ULA addresses will do wonders to prevent people ending up on the street, because they provide safety net for people. to remain housed.
And Zarita, did you
And
want to
that was
follow up to
excellent.
that?
Yeah, in addition to that, I wanted to say, it was mentioned earlier that when someone loses their housing, it does something to them and their spirit, not only physically, but emotionally and psychologically. And those effects last a long time. So we want to take and really be mindful of trying to decrease the causes of homelessness, with these eviction protections, and then try to house the people that are out there. Because there is something called the determinants of hell, and everything is affected when you do not have housing. Resources are limited when you do not have housing. And so I just wanted to take and put that little caveat there. Back to you, Ethan.
Yeah, Kath, I have a question for you. I'm curious to know if you think that the Alliance is bringing together housing and labor justice goals.
Yes, definitely. Measure ULA is special in that, it's supported by labor unions and the construction trades and building trades. And that's because it will create good paying jobs. The prediction is that it will create over 40,000 good paying jobs in the first 10 years. And that's with project labor agreements, which are bargaining between the workers and the developers to ensure that people are paid a livable wage. And labor justice and housing justice are linked, right? Because workers need to afford housing, and development of housing should create fair paying jobs. And so when we can unite those goals, we can get further as a movement, and we can accomplish more. And I think Measure ULA is a testament to that, right? Because we have housing justice advocates and labor justice advocates coming together for this measure.
Okay. I have another question here from someone who wants to know, will the money of Measure ULA build housing directly, or will it be the current model where the developer has to piece together funding from multiple sources?
I can take that, and also other panelists can take that too. So 70% of the funding from Measure ULA will go directly to buying, building, and preserving affordable housing. So there will be new construction. In terms of whether so the answer is yes to the question. The 70% goes toward the actual affordable housing and building right away. The other 30% of the funding goes toward the upstream measures that we were talking about for tenant protections.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think I have one. Did anyone else want to follow up to that question and add on? Okay, I have one last one, which is, how can we make housing a legal right and get beyond the commodification problem?
That's a great
That
one.
one's a doozy. I think.
Well, I can start that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think the housing crisis, I call it, it has several parts. Sometimes I call it an octopus, sometimes I call it a kraken. But, we have to attack each one of the tentacles at a time. So renters protections is one. And decommodifying the housing is actually two. But also working on newer policies is three. A measure like this one, Measure ULA, will not only create the funding stream, but also allow us to do housing faster. So this is part of the problem. So, it was mentioned that, we're trying to stop the housing crisis, but there's more people being unhoused as we're housing others. This is where this bottleneck and this problem is happening. We haven't stopped it, but we still, those of us that are in the tenant realm, we're working very, very hard to repeal things that were done in the past and also pass new things that will help in the future.
Yeah. Someone asked, does anyone else want to follow up to that?
Sure. I think.
Go ahead, Kath.
Oh, sorry, Andrina. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question, and I think it's multifaceted. Answering as the ACLU, not as Measure ULA coalition member, just answering as ACLU. We support the creation of a legal right to housing. We support a constitutional amendment that would create a right to housing for everyone. We support the right to permanent adequate housing under the law. And it's not a magic bullet, right? Because there are countries, in the world that have that. And there's international law definitions of what adequate housing means, under the law. But it's one piece of the puzzle. Getting a right to housing would be major and important, and it would create an obligation on the part of local and state government to take action and fund housing at scale. But it's not a magic bullet. There's no one legal tool that we have that's going to solve everything, but it's one piece. So yes, we do support a right to housing as a legal right.
Okay,
Andreina,
I have another question here. Andreina, did you want to chime in on that, or?
Yeah, you two did a great job, but I'll add my little 2 cents. As Kath mentioned in the past, this is a number that we see increasing. It's a new phenomenon that started in the 70s, and I think part of changing that is changing the way we look at housing. We've mentioned like commodification of it, and it can be as simple as pointing out to people like it doesn't have to be this way. Like it doesn't have to be that, the rent goes up and up and up and there's nothing to stop. Like there's nothing we can do because we thankfully live in a society where we can decide, like we can't prioritize landlords making billions and billions of dollars off of the back of the working class in Los Angeles. And at a whim, destroying neighborhoods, at a whim, destroying lives. Simply because those lives are precious to us. So it's a matter of changing our values around. And when we change our values, we change our laws as well. And I think that's part of this movement, as Kath mentioned, to get housing declared to be as a right that everyone has. Similar how we would think it unconscionable that someone didn't have access to water. Nowadays or power. I think similarly, we need to start seeing housing as like a utility, like necessary to foster human life. And therefore it has to be treated in a special way outside of what we've been treating it like as a normal, like a jacket from H&M, like it's different. It keeps people alive. And it should be treated differently that way.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And so I think we're just going to have time for one more question. And I think this is a good question to kind of end on is how, and this is for any of the panelists can answer this, how is Measure ULA a racial justice initiative?
Yeah, I can address that from our perspective. The homelessness population in Los Angeles skews particularly Black and it skews male. Significantly so. Black people make up about 8% of the population in Los Angeles. They're overrepresented in homelessness at 40% or so. And that comes from a lot of issues of redlining, gentrification, racial discrimination when applying to buildings, and any kind of addressing of any kind of housing justice disproportionately will affect Black unhoused folks because they're the victim of a lot of these policies. They're kind of like the number one affected group. Also, like Latina head of households are one of the largest demographics for evictions in Los Angeles. So when you're talking about preserving housing and keeping people housed and protecting people's housing, you're automatically going to be protecting those groups that are most affected by those policies, which are people of color.
Got it. Did anyone else want to add anything to that, or?
Yeah, I'd like to add. And then I also think, with the funding, with the targeting of the low income and the seniors, we're building more housing and we're building it in the areas in which the people want to reside, their communities, then they can stay within their community and they can live in something that they can afford. And so, it's not about not building housing for one type of individual. It's building a lot of housing in the places where they're needed most. And generally, the areas in which they were targeted is really some of them needed the most.
Yeah. Thank you for
Absolutely.
that. Well, I want to say, Kath, did you want to give us a final thought on that question as well?
Sorry, Ethan. Yeah, I think the other two panelists have really done a great job and addressed this. And as Andrina said, the folks who will be most impacted by Measure ULA are communities of color in LA. And I think there's a lot of overlap between Measure ULA and the recent reparations report in California, which has an entire housing justice section that includes a lot of the measures, including subsidies for housing, homeownership programs, renter protections, things like that are all included in Measure ULA. So I think there's a big tie-in with the recent recommendations that came out of the reparations committee at the state level too.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you. Wait, Zarita, did you say you agree?
I was definitely gonna agree with Kat, and giving a speech to the DOJ regarding the reparations for the committee was phenomenal, and they did take everything that we were saying into consideration. So kudos to you, Kat, for remembering that.
Kudos to you for testifying before that committee and including those recommendations.
Well, I want to just say kudos to everyone. And I want to thank everyone who submitted really, really great questions for the panelists. And thank you for joining the SoCal UPFRONT, the ACLU of Southern California's new ongoing discussion series. And this panel, Just Solutions, Equitable Housing in LA. We're going to bring that action slide back up again so everyone can review items and remind you of some of the steps that you can take to get involved. But we really thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, panel, for all of your expertise. And I just want to say, everyone, have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.